I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy. And with us today is Indra Adnan, a political innovator from the UK, who has been innovating, creating a new vision of politics and political possibilities, what it can be, what it can do for us, how it can best serve our deepest needs, and not just the more material, somewhat superficial perspectives and needs that are usually addressed in our political thinking. Indra is a multifaceted person. She's a psychotherapist, a writer. She's also what she calls a social psychotherapist. And she's a consultant on what she calls soft power. That is not the hard power of military and economics, but rather the soft power of ideas and inspiration. Her clients have included the Danish and Brazilian governments, the World Economic Forum, and NATO itself. She's founded at least two significant political movements. One is the Alternative UK, an alternative political movement aspiring to a broader and deeper vision of what politics can be in the UK. And even broader than that, she has been a co-founder of the Alternative Global, which is a social and political platform serving systemic transformation. It has many functions, including bringing together the many diverse planetary regeneration projects that work around the world, often working without knowing of each other. And the Alternative Global seeks to bring these together to coalesce them into a more coherent and effective force. Indra, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and to meet you both and to have this conversation.
Well, us too, because you've been a real, as I reflect on your life and work and on your most recent book, Waking Up, the Politics of Waking Up, Power and Possibility in the Fractal Age. As I was reading that and reflecting on your life, it seemed that there are a number of themes that run through your work and thinking, and that you've been a political innovator who's really sought to reimagine or revision the political and social. And you've brought perspectives to this revisioning of what politics can be and what it can do that have been, some of them, quite unusual. For example, you've been a very deep and committed contemplative. And you've also brought integral studies, this big picture framework to bear. And of course, you have your own perspective as a woman and your feminist perspective. So, and your attention to relationships and soft power. So there's a lot, and I've only run through a partial list, but let's start at the beginning with the contemplative and spiritual, because that's where you start your book. You start your book in a situation where you're exposed for the first time to the power of a spiritual community affecting an empowerment of a social group, a village. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your contemplative practice and how that's inspired you and informed your vision of politics.
Yes, well, I've been a Buddhist for over 30 years now. And I was raised a Catholic, and my father came from a Muslim community. And my father's Indonesian, my mother's Dutch. And so I was always in the space of bridging between many different religious traditions, if you like. But the most formative experience, probably, the most formative experiences, I would say, of my life, one was leaving Holland to move to the UK. And then the second one was the death, and then the series of deaths that my family had to contend with when I was when I was a teenager. So my brother died when I was 11, and then of the 7 brothers and sisters that my mother had, 6 of them died of cancer while I was a teen. And this really propelled me into this very big question when I was still very young, which is, where is my power? You know, what control do I have over my life? I remember the very night that my brother was in a car crash and I pleaded with God to save his life, not really knowing that my brother was probably already passed at that point. But this relationship with a deity that, as it appeared to me as a child, to use its power to make a difference to my life, in a sense, was broken from that moment on. And throughout my teenage life, I was looking for something to replace that, something that gave me a new sense of, I suppose what I was looking for was a kind of dependency, or something to trust that I knew I could give my life to. And I found that I found that it really wasn't there while I was in my teens, and that I had to create my own, if you like, spiritual belief about where my brother was now, who I was now, what life was. And the question around where is my agency continued until I got to Indonesia when I was 22. I guess it was my gap year experience, if you like. I went back to see my family. I'd met them once before when I was 13, and then I decided to go and spend more time there in Indonesia, find my roots. And that's where I met Buddhism for the first time. But a very specific form of Buddhism, which was Japanese, Nichiren Buddhism. Some of your listeners will be familiar with. And what that was not so much inward-looking meditation as chanting. So the chanting was still definitely a way to concentrate the mind, but there was a very big aspect of revelation in it as well. So through concentrating the mind, through being able to detach or move into a non-attached space, something could be revealed through that. And I described the episode in my book where I went with these Buddhists. At this point, I wasn't chanting myself yet. I was just an observer. I'd gone as a journalist to Indonesia to write and observe, what was going on in a different part of the world. And I'd been invited to join these Buddhists on their field trips into the outskirts and into the jungles, really, around the main cities. And there was one particular village called Talawa that we went to, and it was very typical of the kind of visits that we would make. So that we would go, my uncle, who was the leader of this Buddhist movement, would give a lecture in Indonesian. I couldn't understand really what he was saying, but there was always this repetitive phrase that he was using, ada. So what I would hear was him talking in a very soothing way. It sounded very hypnotic almost, and hear him punctuate his sentences with ada. And I wanted to know later on, what does this mean, ada? What was the nature of that word? And it meant it's there, or there is. So typically when I heard from the translations later on, it was something like, you think you don't have the power, you do. You think there are no resources, there are. You think there is no opportunity, it's there. So this ada was a sort of, if you seek, you will find, or if you pay attention, it will be revealed to you. So this kind of practice was very intriguing to me, especially since on our journeys, I witnessed, coming to visit a small village like this, which was typically very dependent on the military aid in Indonesia to deliver food parcels every week. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners know the history of Indonesia, but there was military rule for decades, and they became, very, very successful in being able to deliver food to people and to create networks and to, in a way to hold things together and bring people out of poverty. But the people themselves became quite dependent on this. So a typical village would be that they would be receiving these food parcels living in relative, quiet and peace, but nothing happened. And the young people there would be very impatient, not impatient, but they would like be a bit stuck. There was a stuckness about these places. We'd arrive, there would be a lecture. At this point, people were still walking to the river for a couple of hours to get water. It was peaceful, but slow and not developing at all. He would come, we would come, we'd hear a lecture, they would talk about what they'd heard, and we'd go. And then maybe 6 weeks later, we'd come back. And in that very short space of time, things had started to happen already in that small village. People had cleared space for planting seeds. A road was beginning to be built. Somebody had found a way to bring the water closer to the village. Somebody had moved out of their house, of their parents' house, and moved into a separate house. I mean, these sorts of small but significant changes had started to happen. And this was the phenomenon I wanted to explore and understand.
So it sounds like you saw that these people were becoming empowered, and I'm wondering how that. My sense is that so much of your work has been about taking that into your political vision. Is that what happened for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So this idea that we can settle, if you like, for a kind of reality that is, that our parents had, or that, as far as we're concerned, was always the way of things. This is our life. And then that could be disrupted by somebody coming along and saying, look again, reimagine, pay attention. Something else is possible. That in itself would cause a shift to happen and then create energy in that space. That's what I saw happening, and that's what you're absolutely right. That's what I've been exploring ever since.
And what is it in coming now to the way you've tried to reinvigorate and re-envision politics? What is it you see us settling for, and what in our usual social political situation? And what is the more you're seeing that we could be doing and become?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a story, but if, I'll try to keep it succinct so that we can see so I can answer the point of your question. But when we think about the multiple crises that we are facing now, right? So we're in this multiple crisis: the crisis of the environment, the crisis of well-being, the crisis of division. And then you read the newspapers and you're part of a social imaginary, if you like. The sense is that the people are powerless, that they themselves are very dependent on politicians or corporations to make the difference. And in reality, that is the structure that we're living in. So in the States, but also all across Europe, and certainly in the UK, only 2% of people are actually signed up to this party political system. Only 2% of people become members, meaning that they think it's worth the investment of their time and money. Most people don't. And the reality is that they only have a vote every 4 or 5 years, depending on your system. And then certainly in your country and ours, you only have a choice of 2 parties, really. In reality, you go left or you go right. And these 2 parties are invested in each other's failure. This is the really significant thing about the system that we're in, that our agency is trapped in this binary competitive system that, leaves us with no real obvious path to change. So that every day you're reading about that in the paper, right? Because the media system feeds on that discourse. So every day you're feeling viscerally your powerlessness. And what I'm trying to show to people, when we started to look at this more carefully and we committed ourselves to stepping outside that 2% bubble and looking what is really happening outside of the news as we hear it, we discovered that, as anybody would, the solutions to our problems are already available. The question is, why do we not have access to these solutions? So we made it our job to do three things. We do a daily alternative blog, which talks about the many solutions. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that's structured, but it has a structure. We do the job of connecting, we're sort of systems conveners. We connect the dots around people that we feel are building this, what Buckminster Fuller would describe as the new system that makes the old one obsolete. But most importantly, we're building and helping to build and drawing attention to what we call community agency networks that already exist on the ground. So community agency networks, which we call CANs, on the one hand are the natural networks that have always existed, the ones that the women perhaps are creating through their care networks or their family networks or their social networks. These networks have always been present in a way, but over the last 30 years, since the birth of the internet, they've been taking shape more consciously and proactively as responses to the climate crisis and the social injustice crisis. So you might think of transition towns or eco-villages or municipalities, or in India, neighborocracy or mutual aid networks. There are many, many, many of these CANs springing up with the help of technology to bring the solutions that are already available around the globe. So these are local, grassroots organizations that are nevertheless able to draw down from all over the world solutions, methods, blueprints even, in a way that we call cosmo-local. So cosmo-local community agency networks beginning to be the new system in small ways all over the world. And our sense is that if we can connect these cosmo-local community agent networks together and create a governance apparatus within them, then we have a new way for the people's voice to hear itself and to be heard by the mainstream. So that's kind of a new politics as we see it.
Indra, I wanted to ask you a question. Start out like maybe your first sentence. You talked about your Buddhist practice over these years and the chanting and the revelatory aspect of your practice. I wanted to ask you how much of what you're doing now in your life and what you put together has come out of that practice and that revelatory aspect of the tradition you're in and what you're practicing.
Yeah, I would say it's a natural manifestation of the changes that happened on the inside. So in particular, there's a few things that I would draw attention to. For example, the concept of the three realms, right? So in Buddhism, they would say there's nowhere inside or outside. There's simply the three realms of existence. So we have the personal realm, this sense of ourselves as agents in the world. This is the first realm. The second realm is really the community or the context within which we are being that person. That's the second realm. And then there is everything beyond that, if you like, the third realm. And we call that the I, the we, and the world. So our not only our politics, actually, but I would say the normal social understanding is that you're either an individualist or you might be a communitarian or a socialist or a globalist, right? But what Buddhism has always, I use the word claimed, but, helped us seen, is that the same person can be all three of those things. So I have a personal world and I defend it, and it's my sovereignty is very important within it. but I don't need to switch into being somebody else to have a community self. I'm also a member of a family, a member of a friendship circle, a member of my local, neighborhood and so on. And I think about the world. So when I think about the world, I'm having an impact upon it. I'm shaping it in a certain way. And how I change my idea about the wider world changes my idea of where my agency lies. So these three realms are essential to an understanding of how we can have agency, even a new political agency, by, in a sense, taking down these barriers between these three ways of being in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And your book is titled "The Politics of Waking Up," and you've spoken about one kind of sort of waking up is that waking up various communities to each other's presence and connecting them. So that's kind of one kind of awareness of waking up. But I have a sense your politics of waking up is really aimed at a deeper kind of awakening than that. Would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, it deeper and more superficial, in fact, because we could look at it in two ways. So the waking up, I think, the deeper waking up that you're describing is really to do with this oneness of self and environment. In my form of Buddhism, this is called Engi. And Engi really describes the indivisibility of self and environment, or past, present, and future. So all the separations that we make as material human beings, which help us to have traction, if you like, or to help us organize our space, can be dissolved again in a spiritual way. So the separateness of the internal and the external can dissolve, or the sense that the past is a different place, different, if that happened then, or the future is something that has not yet materialized. From a Buddhist perspective, it's all contained in the present. So waking up to Engi, the non-separation or the interdependence of these other spaces is essential. It's an essential part of that waking up. But in my book, what I'm talking about is a different notion of waking up, which is that, since the birth of the internet, say over the last 30 years or a bit more, because of the availability of information, we went from this relationship with information that we used to get it from above, in a sense. It was our teachers, it was our bosses, it was our politicians that edited the kind of information that we would be able to get access to. And then suddenly, in a very short period of time, that changed, and we were able to not only receive information from everywhere, but start to generate that information ourselves, or proactively go and look for something, or put two things together that couldn't be put together before. At the same time, this sense of waking up to your capacity for connecting and mobilizing, bringing people together. The miracle, I don't know if for the first time you use a hashtag, for example, and find that you can, in a lightning instant, connect with a global community of people who are interested in what you're interested in. When I used hashtag soft power, for example, a global community of people interested in soft power. You could do the same with, hashtag multicolored socks, if you like, whatever it is that you wanted to find your tribe, it was suddenly an instant possibility. And the third thing about that is that you could begin to see yourself in the public space. So women, maybe more, even more than men, maybe not used to seeing themselves as much in the public space, could suddenly put themselves in the public space, or young people, or anyone with technology could suddenly build their own world with them in it. So this is a radical shift of agency happening over this 30 years. I mean, unless you'd lived through it, you probably wouldn't know how steep that curve was. I mean, certainly my son hasn't got a clue. He has no idea what we didn't have before and what he was born to have. Only we will know, what difference that made. But that radical, stepping into some sense of presence, connectivity, agency, has, as we know, caused a lot of chaos. I'm not pretending that that was an uncomplicated good thing. It was just a very, very new space. But what we saw as a result was people waking up. So, of course, there were the entrepreneurs who could make a lot of capital out of this new connectivity. But the other side of it was people learning for the first time, especially underprivileged people, learning for the first time about why they were in the situation they were. It's realizing it's not my fault I'm in such a difficult position because of what they can learn and what conversations they can have. And this has caused, I suppose, what we would now describe as the woke phenomenon of, people feeling not only their pain, but also mobilizing now and sharing that message with others.
So you described the recognition, firstly, the finding of community and the recognition that our situation is multi-determined, and you mentioned women coming into these public communities in a way they haven't before. And we've both been wondering, well, how has your experience as a woman informed and enriched the political vision you're creating?
Yeah, it's not necessarily very easy to describe, Roger, to be honest, because it's not an empty space. It's not like you're walking into an empty space that you could simply occupy. Feminism, has a history, and it has determined the ground for women in many ways in terms of what is being said about female power, or female subjugation, or there's a huge and rich history there. So whatever it is that I might add to that will be we're moving into that space. But I'd like to think that through my interest, from my point of view, that what can move better into the public space now is the way that women work in a sense, the way that they themselves see possibility and the future, which is beginning to become more and more distinct from the socioeconomic political system that we have accepted as real. So the way I like to think about it is that, for centuries, women were really in the private and the domestic space more than in the public space. And that our public space, as we understand it, its institutions, its structures, its power bases, was mostly designed by men. But, women were always very active, building a different kind of private space that did the work of supporting communities, supporting the men themselves, supporting their families. That was, just as profound and just has as much architecture in it, is every bit as active, but in different ways than the public space was. And what the internet has done is really, again, dissolve the lines between these two things and make a more feminine way of structuring and organizing more visible. So I would include in this, for example, the way that we now talk about networks. This is the way we always organized in families and communities. It was always dependent on networks rather than dependent on individuals. And that obviously has already moved, concretely into the public space. But there's also something about a more relational way of being that women have depended on to get their work done which has not been so easy to understand in the public space. In the public space, you have to build the architecture, in a sense, build the bureaucracy that makes that thing accountable. Whereas now more and more we see that there is power in this more narrative, storytelling, image-led, emotionally intelligent way of operating that has become
could you
as
give us
popular. Yeah.
Could you give us a concrete example of what you're talking about? Like how that plays out or what you're seeing?
How it's actually changing. You
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Well, I mean,
what
you might say that what we're doing now is that kind of, you know, we're in conversation now, and something is real and concrete about the way that we are, through our conversation, imagining a different future, creating a new imaginary. This is really what soft power is. It doesn't depend necessarily on, you know, first we have to build the foundations, then we have to materially build the institution before something can arise. It's arising all the time. And we can even depend on it and rely on it as something that will have agency and be able to achieve certain ends. So this to me is a more, you know, it's a more dense, more, Karen O'Brien describes it as a quantum way of working, you know, working through relationship without having to necessarily pin down the coordinates of every relationship. We're doing that more and more. So take, for example, the power of social media is very similar to that kind of power. It has an agency of its own. However, it needs containing. That's also very much a feminine idea. It needs incubating, right? So if you think about the energy of that social media, which has no, system of incubating and containing itself, it's not self-organized. That's why it looks so very chaotic to all of us. And our proposition is that all of that energy released through the internet can be incubated and self-organized to create a new system that has power in it. So I don't know if that's answering your question, John, but I would say that it's a way of looking at the phenomenon of our lives today that makes, that I would say from a feminine perspective, looks very positive, and very often from a male perspective looks dangerous and possibly looks more like something breaking down. I would say that I've had many experiences like this in rooms where men are talking about everything that is breaking down and how to cope with the breaking down and how to feel in this not knowingness about this current moment in time. And women who are talking about the very same moment in time as an emerging fractal new system of networks and network of networks that is positive and the way to go, right? So it's quite phenomenal, if you like, that these two ways of looking at the same thing can be really quite different.
Indra, I'm trying to feel into what I think you're saying, and let me see if this speaks to part of it, and that is, my sense is that, you know, the traditional ways of dealing with power and politics have focused on goals and structure and outcome and making things happen. And what I hear you saying is that for you, and perhaps more generally, women in general, there tends to be more of a focus on the quality of relationships underlying that. Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think that is part of it. And of course, I must rescue myself from saying that this is just women and just men, you know, because men too are actively taking part in this change. And women, of course, are also actively in the old system that is crumbling. It's not a strict divide.
Sure.
I'm thinking more about a more feminine structures that women easily occupy, if you like, and the old structures which were historically designed by men when really working on their own. But now that we're working more of us together, that line becomes more blurred. But the new structures, what you've described there, relational, understanding that the agency and the power comes from these relationships. That's where people come alive, and we can all experience that. That in meeting a new person or meeting someone that isn't part of our usual circle, just in a conversation, whole new possibilities arise for those two people. So there's something of this. It's not simply a line that connects two people. A relationship connects two worlds, and that makes energy and possibility that, if properly nurtured in these kinds of incubators that I'm describing, can really lead to very new outcomes for the people that are involved.
And I'm getting a sense of that in the moment. That what you've been saying has drawn me to focus more on the way the three of us are interacting in this moment. And I'm getting a feel for that, and out of our connection, out of our dialogue, I have the opportunity of getting to see things the way you do a little better, and open possibilities, and appreciate some of the things you're pointing to. So I'm aware that whether you're creating, we're co-creating a kind of microcosm of what you're pointing to, and I'm appreciating that.
That's great, actually. And my natural inclination really would be now to interview the two of you.
Well, go
whatever you want. Hey,
well, fine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know how you see this moment in time, and how what do you feel about these possibilities of this age?
Well, let's make it sure this goes all ways, that all of us share in this. So it's exactly what you've been pointing to, the possibility of collaborative birthing of something more than each of us alone has an understanding. I would, but briefly, what comes to mind for me is just, how do I see the current age? I see it as an enormously complex time of crisis and opportunity, which the outcome of which could span all the way from the collapse of our civilization and the near extinction of our species to a birth of a new individual, personal, transpersonal, social, political ways of being, the likes of which we have not seen and which we can't even fully envision at this moment. And I'm fully agnostic about how it will turn out, and I assume it will turn out. How it will turn out will be a function of how we approach it.
Yeah, and
that feels positive, John.
Yeah, the deep transformation, the vision when we were first discussing this, it was to try to go deeply into what will help us transform. And either it's kind of transform or die. In other words, we need to kind of really to get together as a human family, or we're not going to get together at all. And so far, I've been transformed by the conversations and the connections and the readings and this. But about 30 years ago, maybe more than that, I came across a book while I was working with Fritjof Capra at the time as his assistant in grad school. Physics, The Turning Point. I love the man, great respect for him and his work. And he gave me the book Beyond Power by Marilyn French, which I don't know if people still read Marilyn French, but it was like the feminist, Bible at the time. It was a big, powerful book. And I was blown open by it. I was like, oh my God, and I felt so bad as a man, because I really, I then my question, can I be a feminist? And finally, I said, okay, yeah, I think I can be. And I talked to, the women around there and said, okay, I'm a feminist. Well, isn't that nice? Yeah, that feels a lot better. And, but I would also like to ask you, because we're men, we're here, and we're getting a lot of heat, deservedly in many cases. But what do you want from us? What would you like us to hear as a woman who's, in this kind of cutting edge of looking for answers and bringing us together in new, healing, powerful ways? What can we do to be part of that more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, John, for asking that question, because women are waiting to be asked that question all the time. That may surprise you, because they feel we have to push our way in. And there is a bit of a phenomenon right now of men studying the feminine and claiming it, right? So even now, it happens a lot that men will explain the feminine in the public space and still not invite the women. And you'll see that the phenomenon still exists, that men continue to lead the public space. They may include women, meaning they'll give women a role to play in their, in their structure in some way. But the real interest is that they talk to each other most of the time still, even now. And it's not, and I know it's a very dangerous thing, and apologies to the trans community or anybody who feels they're not included in this discussion about men and women. But believe me, you are included, because we're really talking about a historical divide and different ways of working. But what we can't ignore is that in the question of nature and nurture, we can't ignore that they collude, right? That because of our different natures, therefore we have been differently nurtured, and we find ourselves with quite different roles and quite different histories. To my mind, there's no requirement for a man to be more like a woman unless that person chooses. I'm not looking for a world which is all now adapting to the feminine. The men should be able to continue to be men and to find satisfaction in being men. However, they have to make way for more women. And that's not an easy thing to do, because I find that men are so wired to be the dominant species that they haven't even got the experience to know what making space for someone else really feels and looks like. So making space for someone else is sometimes including them, in the project, or giving them a role to play, as I described before. But really making space sometimes means giving up your seat, ironically, letting someone else take that, moment in the spotlight to say something that needs to be said. It's making space. And that isn't just for women. It's also for all the excluded people of the past. We say that, when women are fighting for space, it's not for themselves, it's for everyone else that was also excluded in the history of white men dominating the space. To make space for everyone. So there's quite a lot of moving over required. And I find that is difficult to achieve. But more than that, no, it's not that the masculine energy can disappear from the system. It really mustn't, and the yangness, I think from the yin yang perspective, I like to think of yang as more in the public eye, in the spotlight, where the light is, and the yin is more the context, around that light. Yin is not a bad place to be at all, and women have mostly occupied the yin space over centuries. But now is the time for that, moving with all of their knowledge and architecture into the light more, And it may be the time now for men to step back more into the yin and learn more about themselves and about their homes and about their children and so on. So that from a yin yang perspective, that gets more balance between male and female ways of acting and ways of working. I don't know if that answers your question, John, but
it's certainly been an ongoing
yeah.
question for me, and
Yeah.
you know, I realize we're struggling with this. We're trying to come to a better balance,
Yeah.
and we live in times where masculine and feminine gender identity, and obviously there's some women that are super masculine and nobody needs to make room for them because they just boom, they move in, and then there's men that are really feminine who are, you know, so it's this mix. I think
but
probably, maybe his awareness, as in my case, when I became aware of the assumptions I was giving from my culture about women, and my mom was, you know, was a very powerful woman, sweet woman. She just did her thing, and she never felt, you know, that anybody was her boss. So I just grew up with this woman who was really happy in her own space, and she had a very successful business, and people just adored her. But somehow she had a great deal of innocence too, because she didn't pick up that there were any injustice in the world. She just did her thing with great joy and efficacy. So that's kind of my, and then when I got into the world, yeah, I started seeing that. And I've also seen in my lifetime that there's been a lot of progress made in a lot of areas, in racial areas, and women come to the fore. And these processes are often painful, you know, and you're going to have your, you know, your resistance, your conservatives that fear that what they value is going to be destroyed by the new wave. And then you have people that see no value in the old ways, that want to just do everything new. And here we are trying to, you know, find wisdom and act with compassion and act effectively. And it's a tall order, but I think it's what we're being called to do. So the more you can let us know what you need from us.
Well, I can't be a spokesman, but I would say partnership is a good plan.
Yeah.
You know, partnership is a good plan. But to be aware that, you know, women being successful in the public space is not an uncomplicated thing. You know, so I would love to know your mom, for example, and to know how she did what she did. Because in my experience in politics, for example, the women going into politics were obliged to adopt the male, you know, behavior. They wouldn't be successful if they didn't do that. They had to be better men than the men. Margaret Thatcher was the best man in politics, right? And that is not the same as a woman. That is not the same kind of shift I'm talking about. And unfortunately, that's been the case for the, you know, certainly for the late 20th century, early 21st century. Women stepping into the men's shoes is not quite what I'm describing when I'm thinking about, I'm sure you understand that.
Yeah, can you give us some examples of women that we should look up to that are kind of doing that yin yang balance and are stepping into positions of authority and leadership that we can kind of go, okay, and learn something?
Yeah, I mean, you know, whenever it's funnily enough, even that question is challenging because it's difficult to see. And I'm rather loath to recommend the most successful ones, because the ones I want to draw attention to are the ones that are doing it all the time, right? So the ones that hold your communities together. You know, for me, the most inspiring group of people I ever worked with were social workers, who are mostly women, who had such an advanced, you know, intuitive understanding of people's needs that, you know, with very, very little money at all, they could rescue people in a way that governments could never rescue people, right? They could help them reclaim their autonomy. They could help them find purpose. They could help them find belonging. You know, it's this ability to work with a human through their, you know, real needs, not just their material needs, their emotional and spiritual needs as well. That it just came intuitively to them because of giving themselves to the task. And these women are the very women who never get recognized. Worse than that, they get blamed for every small mistake that is made, or they get blamed for the fact that, despite the fact that they could hold these families together for such a long time, this family was still destroyed by by having their money taken away from them, or having the, or not passing a certain test, or failing in the, the social workers conundrum is always, damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned if you interfere and damned if you don't interfere. They had an impossible task always. But my experience, I spent 2 years working on a project with my partner, Pat Kane, called Reimagining Social Work. And this was the most enlightening period of work that I think I ever did. And I find that again and again, that I'll give you another great example. In the UK, you might have got a hint of a program that David Cameron tried to unleash called The Big Society. Did that ever reach your shores here? Did you hear about it? The idea is that as a politician, he was now going to big up the big society and say, the natural work of communities is the thing that we want to increasingly, trust and depend on. Right? Sounds like a good idea, right? But what actually happened was that they had a huge budget for this. They appointed all sorts of, entrepreneurial projects under the title Big Society, almost all of them run by men, and took away some of the budgets of the women who were doing their very badly paid work in communities already. And it was such a illustration of the not understanding the true work that this feminine agency has, and replacing it with something that works, in the capitalist system, so to speak, the measurements, the ways of measuring, the ways of managing, the ways of applying, the lack of relationship actually in the way that they were doing it. It just showed up these two completely wrong ideas about how a community would thrive in this new idea of communities having power. And it didn't last long. I think it had it ran out of steam and money with no real results in about 4 years.
It sounds like a painful example of exactly what you're talking about, this emphasis on lack of more attention to structure rather than a recognition of the networks at work and would you call it soft power? Is this what you would you refer to this as soft power?
Well, soft power is another piece of the puzzle, Roger. But this is not necessarily what I would describe as soft power. So soft power is you probably know it as a term that was invented by Roger Nye in the 1990s. And he was head of the Kennedy School of Government and advisor to Bill Clinton. And soft power described really not hard power, right? So this is in the era of America having had to retreat from the Vietnam War and trying to make sense of that. So the largest superpower, couldn't beat the tiny country of Vietnam and had to withdraw in this chaotic conditions. It was a moment of possible humiliation for America. And what Joseph Nye said, sorry, I said Roger Nye, what Joseph Nye said was that even if America's hard power is being questioned all over the world, nobody will ever challenge America's soft power. And what he meant by that was the power of attraction. So he was really saying that no matter what happened, the American dream, the idea that anybody could become president, or that no matter where you started, you could succeed, and that it was a free society. The American dream would always pull people towards America, want to make relationship with America. And through that relationship that they wanted to have, America could have influence over the whole of the world because of their attraction built by the American dream. And so the soft power industry, as we know it, Hollywood in particular, or Netflix now, was the machine of generating the attraction of the American dream all over the world. And, he was right about that at that time. The question is, so soft power then, what is it? It's the power of attraction, generating relationship through story, right? So it's really the power of narrative or the power of storytelling to generate relationship and attraction, which gives you influence over others. So
and clearly that has enormous power. It's the kind of narrative which gives us our worldview and our values and our assumptions, and provides the motivation for each of us and cultures to act. And yet the very soft power that you're referring to, the American dream, is for so many people a nightmare. And of course, as with any concept, it can be understood at very different levels as people mature and effectively become wiser. So at one level, the ideals of the American dream are wonderful. On the other hand, the way it is so usually interpreted as, in a very materialistic way, the American dream, the myth that anyone can succeed, when in point of fact there are all sorts of hidden barriers to success, and success being measured in terms of income and 2 cars, blah 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 blah. And the research is crystal clear that the American that kind of a focus such as that on material outcome produces far less satisfied and happy lives than a focus on, for example, exactly what you've been saying, the quality of relationships rather than power, on generativity, that is creativity and contribution, on intrinsic meaning, doing things which have meaning for the very doing of it, rather than getting some goal such as image or achievement. So I'm just wanting to bring in the complexity of something like the American dream, which can be interpreted in so many ways and from so many different levels of understanding and maturation. I know you've been a student of, in fact, you've been a major contributor in London to founding the integral community there, based on the work of Ken Wilber, with a deep appreciation of different levels of development. And so, since I've gone on a rant about this, because I've just been doing a little reading and writing on the American dream, or as some people call it, the American nightmare.
Yeah.
So how would you see the work you do through the filter of the reality that people operate from different levels of development?
Yeah, so good. I'm not sure I understand the relationship between the American dream and the integral framework. Is that what you're trying to ask?
Not necessarily. I just did a rant on the American dream, which actually in its usual interpretation is very materialistic, and the research on that interpretation is crystal clear that those kind of values lead to greater unhappiness in the long term.
Right.
And perhaps
go ahead, John. No, go ahead, John.
Perhaps at different developmental levels, the dream will be interpreted differently. And
right. That's an idea, isn't it? Yeah. It's a complicated relationship between these two things, but I think there is a relationship between them, because it's really, in a way, the story we tell. What is the story we're telling about our reality? And it does shift all the time, and there are different forms of agency, let's say, that would reinterpret it, all the time, right? What's interesting about that is that it persists, right? This American dream somehow persists. It's so much so that China itself wants to challenge with the Chinese dream. But the Chinese dream is actually a version of the American dream, because the notion of an American dream itself is quite American. and is part of the system that we find ourselves in. So let me just dare to say that the whole idea of, anybody can become president, we imagine that as somebody moving up the ladder, right, from nothing to something. And there's a little bit of an echo in that, I think, in the idea of, spiral dynamics and the integral, let's say the image of integral development. It appears to many people as a ladder, right, from something to something. But that in itself is its danger as well. And I'm finding that more and more. And I felt it very strongly when I was hosting the London Integral Circle from the mid-90s to the mid-aughties, as they say. Over that period, we were studying Wilber's works and Kagan, and many of them. This is where I first met Terry Patton. He came to my house where we were having these regular meetings, and I should say actually that Terry was a very humane presence there, as were the other speakers who came. But there came a distinctive moment in the London Integral Circle where the women decided to leave. And the reason they left was because they felt there was an overemphasis on the books that Wilber wrote, literally the page references. What did Wilber mean? What was he really saying? And this intense kind of trying to understand the mind of Wilber, as opposed to, how do we apply this to real life? How is this, how does this appear? How does what Wilber and Kagan talk about, how does this not only appear in us, in our social imaginary, but how can we change it? How can we use our integral knowledge to make a new future come about? Was not really being talked about. So there was this departure from, between two different ways of using what Wilber was bringing. And just John, if you just let me for a second.
Sure.
I feel this is happening more and more now, that the ladder nature of development is not serving the real gifts, if you like, of what an integral outlook on life could bring to our societies, because we're trapping ourselves, or we could be trapping ourselves, in an old language about what development is and what it looks like. So let me just start then, see what it was that you wanted to respond to, John, because I don't want to spend too much time.
No, I think this is really interesting, a subject. And, Roger and I have been involved in the integral world for quite a while. And my work was on integral recovery and taking the integral model and applying directly to the people I was always working with, is alcoholics and drug addicts and their families. And immediately I saw this, this is the Rosetta Stone to help us be more effective than we were being. And I found also in my work with addicts, and I was a wilderness guide, therapeutic wilderness guide for taking young people and adults out that had these issues. And I found that I had to be both a strong male leader, decisive, and sometimes ruthless to save lives. And also I had to be very connective and feminine and compassionate, and to hold people in their grief and pain and hold them in my heart. So it was quite obvious that, to me, as it developed, the skills and the capacities that had developed came with time, became a little more natural. And I realized it was okay to be strong and decisive. It's okay to, that warrior self, and it's okay to be somebody whose heart breaks with people who are suffering, and hold them and be there in their pain and do what we can. And I think developmentalism is something that's constantly developing. The more we look at it, the more, it's grown over the years. And I think maybe that was one of the failings of the the integral model, it was such a beautiful intellectual model that it really attracted a lot of really smart intellectual people, but without heart. And that's for any intellectual movement. Without soul, it can be very arid and very dry and doesn't have a lot of juice.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I think that's a very important aspect. But it's not necessarily what I'm trying to draw attention to at this point, which is this, and as a woman looking at the developmental ladder, let's say, from this to that, my own experience is that, yes, certainly in the first 20 years of life, we're clearly developing our capacities. But beyond that, we develop them very unevenly. For example, to become a parent young in life can zap you right into a sort of teal capacity to, maybe if you've got a number of children and they're all very different, being able to hold that container and allow them all to become independent as very different kinds of people is a kind of teal capacity. It's not something you necessarily have to develop in a straight line. And at the same time, many people who would like to think of this teal capacity would like to jump from orange straight into that space, right? And never develop that moment or even period of life where with the radical equality of everyone really changes who you are, right? I find that a lot of people haven't been through that stage when they're already claiming that they're teal or that they're, yellow or whatever color structure we're using. So I find that it's better to think about these different, what I describe it as forms of agency, different kinds of agency that come from these different conditions in life or different periods of life that then exist within you all the time, like that Russian doll effect, if you like. And depending on how healthy your childhood development was, for example, you might find that they will keep demanding attention. So for many people, the red, that period of our lives when we were, wanting to be heard, want our voices to be heard at all costs. Some people never grew healthily through that. They were just shut up all the time. And if you were shut up all the time and you didn't grow healthily through that, it's still there, livid in you, and it will come out at any time. It could come out in an uncontrolled way or in a controlled way. But I find a lot of people running corporations still have this kind of, this red, very unpredictable in them. So I think it's important to keep the ecology of these different kinds of agency, not on a ladder, but in a more fluid state, which I know is imagined by Teal. But I find that when we're talking or introducing integral to society, it has this laddered image that people imagine they have to reach the higher levels, and that many of the people who are holding these spaces have the material resources to be confident about this teaching. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but it's as if it's already packed into the ladder, this idea that, and the truth that when you have, difficult material circumstances, it's more difficult for you to experience these many levels of agency because your life doesn't offer that to you. But it doesn't mean you don't have it.
Oh.
You do have it.
Difference between potentials and the environment which allows us to express them. Yeah. Let's see. I'm aware that we're probably coming towards the end of our time, but I have certainly another question I'd like to ask you. But I'm also aware that you really turned the tables on us at a point and asked us some questions. And so I'm just wondering, which was beautiful because it brought another, it instantiated exactly what you've been talking about, the power of out of relationship, new possibilities emerging. And I really appreciate what you did. And I'm just wondering, is there anything else you'd like to ask us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite curious about whether you yourselves feel, you know, we are part of the integral legacy, if you like. We've all been through it from the beginning, right? Do you yourselves feel that it's possible that the way it sees itself is now itself evolving or needs to evolve in order to really serve a wider landscape, a wider field? Does that ring true for you, or is that something that?
Yeah, maybe just to set a context for your question, Indra, because not everyone in our audience will be familiar with integral, but integral is Ken Wilber's conceptual framework, his remarkable synthesis, probably the biggest conceptual map we have in our time for understanding both human nature, life, the way in which different ideas fit together. It's truly a remarkable synthesis of unprecedented scope and gives a framework for understanding our lives in very powerful ways. And I think all of us would certainly recommend it. But you're asking the question, Indra, is this movement evolving itself in the way it sees itself? John, do you want to?
Yeah, well, you know, there when Ken got sick and the big thing that was going on in Boulder for years, and I got in right up the end of that. I was living in Utah at the time. That kind of blew up for various reasons that we don't have to get into. And so there was this diaspora. We all went our own ways and we all did our own things. And a lot of the conferences and the get-togethers stopped in the United States. And the only one that the last man standing or last person standing is IEC, the Integral European Conference I'm going to next week. And so there's been a lot of diversity. And just recently I've been thinking that I think this, and I like the way you said integral legacy. There's a lot of people that are leaders that are coming to the fore, and Roger's is one of them, I think, and Diane Hamilton and Steve McIntosh in politics, and of course Terry, big-hearted Terry, bringing that into politics, and we talked to him, had an interview with him or a conversation a few weeks before he died, and I feel deeply in love with the man, right before he passed. But anyway, but his presence is still with me. So I think, yeah, and I think I see it in people that don't even talk about Ken Wilber, that a lot of the ideas are just getting out, whether it's coming just from the noosphere in general, or people that are passing on the integral way of looking at things is definitely true. And of course, you brought up one of the really important things about the integral movement. Why would all the women leave? I mean, oh my God, that's catastrophic. So boys, we better get our, pull our heads out and recognize that. And why would, we cause such a thing as men? And so, yeah, it's been a bumpy, beautiful, revelatory journey. And I'm still struggling with it. I'm still trying to figure out how to be a better man and at the same time be compassionate and have these values. And I deeply honor Ken and his work and what he brought. He could have handled it a lot worse. I think he's been really dignified in the way he shared. Of course, I wrote a book and that became my career, Integral Recovery. He never asked for any money or said, you're stealing my ideas. He just, was very supportive and kind to me. So it's a work in progress. And I see it is that we have to become more integral in the broader sense of the word if we're going to survive as a human family. And I'm been drawn in karmically into the war in Ukraine right now and helping the Ukrainians, the refugees, and raising funds and being a part of that. And I find what I garnered to be really helpful and a part of my inner work that I don't even have to think about so much anymore. It's just the way I kind of naturally feel and flow into the world. So I don't know if that was a good answer. But as you see, I'm a work in progress, as we all are.
As we all are, John. And I get a very strong sense that you're inviting your heart to lead the way around this. A lot of what you're talking about in response to my questions is, is your heartfelt sense of who you want to be and who you can be. And I think that is the best, that's the right way forward. I mean, that's the right way forward for all of us, right? And then what does it open up as a result is the question. When I look at any space that is still dominant, that is still mostly, I mean, I'm being very crude here, and please accept my apology for this, but if it is still nearly all white men talking to each other, I want them to ask themselves, what would this space look and sound like? If we're thinking about planetary transformation, what would it sound like if it really had all these, at least different voices in the room in a really good balance, to hear from, a Chinese person or an Indian person or an African person, or, and more, and obviously more women, maybe more, maybe we have to think about, different genders, the trans, the non-binary. What would it actually look and sound like with all of these voices talking about integral? Would it sound different?
Sound better.
It probably would, right?
Yeah.
It probably would. And that's the question I just feel has to be held all the time when we're moving from an era of a certain kind of ability to manage information and to share information moves into another way, and when the medium now is so different, what is the new message? And what is this, what is the attraction available to draw us into something that would include everyone without losing any of these principles really at all, but just finding that it's coming out of the mouths of many other people and therefore would sound different and would feel agentically different and viscerally different. That's just the question I'm holding. But I think if the heart leads, you're gonna get to that place. But when we start to get to that place, to really seed, CEDE, seed power, and let go of it, allow other things to rise into that space. When the women left, it wasn't to reject, it was to use the time better. It wasn't, we didn't want to humiliate the men. We wanted to use our time in a different way. And that's really what I'm trying to, highlight.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. And it seems like you're emphasizing the centrality of lived experience and heart-led livelihood as crucial, and as one of the main things I sense you wanting to bring into your social and political work.
Yeah, I would say heart-led for sure, but also, what's the right word for it? I believe in our human capacity for really reimagining and reinventing this world, this planet that we live on. I think we're really holding ourselves back, and that we could really bring in something new, but a lot has to be dropped in order to do that. For me, it's not simply a building project of who has the new technology, who has the new innovation, for me, it's more about what can we drop that allows much more of the energy that was always there, the ingenuity that was always there, the intelligence that was always there, but has been systematically blocked until now. If we can drop our ways of ways of suppressing people and suppressing people, the voices and the creativity of people, I think we will find ourselves in a very new world.
Yeah. And if you were to just to distill the essence of that vision of possibility for us, it's a big question, but could you?
Yeah, it's to come back to the self, really, and to recognize yourself as a complex entity, right? So we've moved from being Homo economicus to being the full biopsychosocial spiritual entity. That's who we are. And then to ask ourselves, if we could really experience that full self, what kind of societies could we be building? And I would say that starts at the community level. A community of any kind, whether it's a town or a city or even a neighborhood or even a family, is a container for experimenting with what is the design of the public space that could honor this full, complex human being. And then when it is doing that and coming into relationship with nature and with its environment, what kind of planet are we actually manifesting as a result of that? So the axis, if you like, of a new politics is I, we, world. It's connecting the health of the human being to the health of the planet via the health of the communities that hold that together and incubate that potential.
Beautiful. And so it sounds like you're coming back to your theme of the interconnection of the three spheres, the personal, the relational, and the global. And I heard you say before that at the heart of that vision is a new image and vision of what we are.
Absolutely at the heart of it. And then when you start to open your eyes to what is already here, we should be amazed that the internet responded actually to our desire to be able to release this kind of energy. I see it as a response. And, even the technology that we have, when we think about Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, each time there's a new innovation that holds this creative potential. It keeps being seized back by the old system, right? We know it keeps being capitalized, but let's not get too distracted by the machinations of the old system. Let's focus on what is being built and what is possible. And that for that reason, we're trying to build a new comms and media system around this, emergent possibility. It's not something that needs to be scaled up by some central power. It's actually a fractal emergence. The patterns that we see arising are appearing everywhere. And that's really what I mean by let go of the control of it, become aware of what is emerging and be in it as your full, complex self in these three realms. So I know you wanted it to be like a one sentence thing, but we could come back to this axis of the I, the we, and the world. If we're occupying that I and acknowledging that we can also occupy the we and the world and find the structures that allow us to do that, that's what we call cans, how these connect with each other and how we tell the story of that ultimately is the soft power that we're trying to build and generate to cause attraction, if you like, towards something that is genuinely different from what we have today.
And it seems like you're again, we come back to the theme of finding the most skillful story or narrative that will acknowledge the fullness of our being and potentials and of the interconnection between the I, the we, and the global. And it feels like in part that's what you're trying to do, is give birth to this new, more generous narrative about who we are and who we can become.
Yeah, and what this moment in history really is.
Yeah. And what is it that gives you hope at this time, Indra?
Conversations like this.
Beautiful.
It's to be in relationship with you at this moment, feeling heard by you and seeing in you the qualities that can take us further. You know, I feel better. I feel better for this hour that we've spent together. And I know that if we can carry these kind of conversations, again, I want to point to the miracle of a Zoom room. You know, it's amazing, right? That we can have such testing conversations and shift even tiny bits towards, I've learned something about you, John, and I've learned something about you, Roger, that now counts in my understanding of what reality is. We just did this in a Zoom room. How many miles apart are we? It's extraordinary, you know, and I want to keep drawing attention to the miracle of this moment, the miracle actually of our connectedness in a very strong and fashionable narrative about our disconnectedness, right? Mm-hmm. So how many Zoom rooms have I been in where people are talking about how disconnected we all are? And I just feel compelled to say, but really this moment, you know, me and you, are we really that disconnected? Let's build on it. Let's build. Let's drop the boundaries that we've created for ourselves. Let's drop the things that divide us from others to say, you know, this is us and that's them. You know, how do we just drop those things, move into these kind of conversations wherever we are, whether you're, you know, standing, you know, in a shop, in your local supermarket, or whether you're in a very eclectic Zoom call like this. You know, things happen when you move into conversation and into relationship with people. And every time we're learning, I'm not saying every experience will be a good one, but every time we're learning something more than we knew before about ourselves and about the other. But if we're not prepared to do that, you know, then it is quite bleak. You know? And I am actively questioning wherever I go, when I hear this very settled, yeah, but we're okay, but the danger is that, you know, or the language about the far right, or the language about the conspiracy theorists, or the language about, you know, sometimes amongst women, the language about men, or sometimes amongst men, the language about women, or, you know, or everywhere where there's some sort of social justice eruption, then suddenly a divide. The people who feel all of this emotion and the people who feel oppressed by that emotion, a new divide, even though those people 5 minutes before that are absolutely on the same territory. So just that, that is the revolutionary act, actually, is to make relationship where you can't make relationship, where before you couldn't make relationship. That is the revolutionary act, and that is the challenge for every one of us, you know, to know who you're not talking to and begin that conversation. That is the fastest way for this to ripple through the universe in a way that could never be organized by some central body. It's simply people taking that on for themselves.
Thank you. I'm touched by that, and I'm also aware that that in a way, in our conversation was a microcosm of what you're describing, and there was a point, maybe a third of the way through, where you brought us into a reflection from these general ideas into a reflection on the nature of our interaction in this moment and our connection. And I just felt the energy and juice go up at that point in a very beautiful, inspiring way, and I can still feel it. And and you've brought us back to that. And so the insight that comes for me is it's in the power of paying attention to this moment of the interaction and relationship that vitality, life comes into our being and our being together.
Absolutely, that I love the way you've described that, and that energy is the life-changing energy, or the world-changing energy, I think, that we're looking for and that we need.
Yes, and it reflects what you spoke to earlier in our conversation, that it's in this moment, it's in the present, that all possibility exists. And, you know, it's said so often that it's almost trite, but it's also profound that this moment is the only time we have. And if you can't be happy now, well, you know, etc. So I want to thank you very much for the richness of ideas you've brought us, but even more for the making them come alive in our dialogue, and giving us a taste, which I'm sure everyone listening will also get a feel for, of the way the aliveness of the contact, the connection, the dialogue, the co-exploration, which has just been wonderful. I mean, I feel myself enlivened by it, so it's just naming it. So thank you very much, Indra.
Well, thank
John.
You. Honestly, thank you so much.
Yeah, real good, Indra. Thank you for your presence and what was created here among the three of us, and it's going out, you know, to our ever expanding community or connections, or however that works. But I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and your book, The Politics of Waking Up Power and Possibility in the Fractal Age, I think you gave a living demonstration of the spirit underneath the words, and the spirit of also the work you are doing, and what you are, the vision of politics and possibility and society that you're working to bring into being. And I think you pointed to, it happens in the microcosm of relationship, and you demonstrated and elicited that from us and in us. So Indra, thank you so much. This has really been a wonderful, wonderful gift.
Thank you so much. Thank you.